Hey, Mark with Spinnaker Property Management. We're back and we are still continuing to review the articles in the initiative 2023-01. And in this particular, we're going to talk about Section 5. And I'll read it here. Landlords must give advance notice of rent increase and pay relocation assistance when significant rent increases require tenant to relocate. As a precaution to raising rent, a landlord must provide the tenant with 2 notices of the rent increase. The first notice must be provided between 210 and 180 days before the rent increase is to take effect. A second reminder notice must be provided between 120 and 90 days before the rent increase is to take effect. Number 2, the notice shall be in a form established by the City of Tacoma, which must include the actual dollar amount of the new rent or rent increase, a description of the rental relocation assistance program, and how the relocation assistance payment will be calculated, if applicable, and must be served in accordance with RCW 59.2.040. Number 3, the section must not apply to the administrator of the rental subsidy when the administrator is notifying the tenant of the change in the tenant's portion of the total rent and the remaining portion of the rent is paid by a subsidy such as a housing advisor. Number 4, at any time after receiving the 180-day notice of rent increase of 5% or more, a tenant deciding to relocate rather than paying the rent increase may send the landlord a request for relocation assistance. Within 30 days of receiving such request, landlords must pay the relocation assistance to tenant. Payment of relocation assistance shall be per dwelling unit, not per person, and shall be split evenly among all tenants. Number 5, the tenant relocation assistance amount shall be equal to 2 months of rent. However, if the notified rent increases over 7.5%, the relocation assistance shall be equal to 2.5 months of rent. And if the notice rent increase is over 10%, the relocation assistance shall be equal to 3 months of rent. This scale is adopted in recognition of the additional time required to find replacement housing when a tenant's current rent is below market rent. Tenant relocation assistance shall be calculated based upon the rent in effect at the time of the 180-day notice. Number 6, landlords shall provide copies of the request of relocation assistance and confirmation of payment to the landlord-tenant coordinator or the city-designated official. Number 7, in the event that the tenant is unable to relocate and remains in the dwelling unit at the increased rent, the tenant must repay the relocation assistance. 8, the requirement to pay tenant relocation assistance will not apply to a landlord and tenant living in the same site of the site has 4 or fewer dwelling units, b tenants who have lived in the dwelling unit for less than 6 months, c a landlord that temporarily rents out the landlord's principal residence during the landlord's absence due to active duty military service. Wow, okay, that's a lot to unpack, and allow me to just go through this so that we can look at this from a different perspective. Number 1, so the housing provider is going to be required to 6 months out predict what the rent would be at the end of the lease term, send out the proper notice, and then send out an additional one. So it's asking the housing provider to do 2 steps, which could be very confusing, timely, and makes it easy for mistakes to happen. So the burden, again, is on the housing provider to follow the difficult steps that are being set forth here through this ordinance, through the initiative. Number 2, okay, so they're asking the city to create a document. So this document hasn't even been created. As a matter of fact, the group behind this initiative is passing the buck to the city to create the form and is asking the city to actually hold the money, as you'll see further down in the area. So they're asking the city to take on additional burdens in addition to the housing provider. 3. Okay, so this one I got. It makes perfect sense that if there is a household in a home and they're on an assistance voucher, then the notice program will stay with what that agreement is because of the governmental restrictions. I got that. But inside the whole thing, why bother? Okay, number 4. We're going to take a moment to pause on this one. So let's make it more complicated, that we're going to set steps of 5, 7.5, and 10% to make things happen differently than any other way. So we're going to make it more confusing, set up the housing provider to possibly miss, have a calculation error, and then have them penalized for it, right? So at the beginning of this, if you go to the top here, it says when significant rent increases, right? So 5% is not considered, in my opinion, significant, especially when insurance is going up, property taxes are going up, utilities are going up, labor to maintain the home is going up, the material to support that maintenance is going up. All those, plus the others I haven't talked about, are going to go higher than 5% on any one year. So when they use the word significant, I think that's a little bit of cheek and gum. They're not being respectful in the word significant. 7.5% or even 10% isn't significant when that's what's happening to all the operating costs that we, the housing providers, have to deal with. And then in turn measures that and make sure that there's no calculation process, or that there's no calculation error, and then send out 2 notices in time for that too. Okay, I think you get my position on that one. So 6, this is where they're asking the city to get involved again, to where once that relocation program process has been initiated, then the city has to get involved to authenticate it and then record it. And then it almost sounds like the coordinator copies of the request for relocation assistance and confirmation of payment to the landlord-tenant coordinator. That sounds like a city position that would be taking the money from the housing provider, putting it into an escrow account, and then taking the time to write a check out to each individual person of the household. Wow. Let's create more burden so that it gets even more confusing. Okay, number 7, in the event that the tenant is unable to relocate, that they're going to give the money back. Do you think that that money is just sitting in a bank account waiting to, like, if we're going to move or not? I'm sure that that money has a strong potential to be utilized for something else and then won't have the money to give back. So now, if that money's sitting in the city with the city's burden, yeah, that would make sense. But if it's going to the occupant, well, then I do have a big concern that they'd be able to give that money back full. Okay, number 8, I totally get it. They're putting in some exemptions in there, and I don't have a problem with that because I have a problem with the whole thing, right? This is an absolute burden that the organization behind this initiative, the Socialist Party, is requiring us to do for the tenants. It's clear that we are, at Spinnaker, focused on balanced, equitable, fair, clean, affordable housing. And this in no way helps that happen, because these costs and these risks will eventually get passed on to the occupants, which makes the rents higher. And again, in no way does this help homelessness, which is what's in the charter from the very beginning. So again, I'm asking you to vote no on Initiative 2023-01 in November. Hey, we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.